Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley, and I'm Lisa Williams, and we are coworkers turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief. In this podcast, we talk candidly about grief in pop culture. No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the confusing, complicated, and sometimes even humorous experience of living life after loss. Hey, this is Eleanor.
And this is Lisa.
And we are from What's Your Grief, coming to you with a very special quarantine edition of the What's Your Grief podcast.
Yeah, so we are coming to you, obviously, from the isolation of our homes. And we're excited to be recording. We've been talking a lot between one another about just the things that are going on in the world right now and how they're impacting grief in so many different ways. So it just seemed like a good time to sit down, record, and talk a little bit about what we've been seeing and experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get into it, just to catch up, I mean, Lisa, you and I have talked, but to catch up with everyone else, how's your quarantine going? Who are you with? What are you doing? How are you staying sane?
That assumes I am. Assumes I am. So my quarantine is going. I live alone, so I am isolating alone, which has certainly been tough. Certainly been tough. And I think it's made me appreciate, like it has for many people, the wonders of the outside world. And one of the things that I think for me, in addition to being alone, I live in a really small space. I live in a cute little tiny 9-foot wide home. So it's not even realistic for me to get a change of scenery very often. I'm kind of in the same two places all the time. So that's been an interesting challenge too, just like how to keep myself entertained in such a small space.
Sure. Yeah, I hear you. We are on quote unquote spring break right now. My kids are. And it's like, yeah, so we're going to spend spring break in the basement and the living room, and we'll spend a little time in the dining room and a lot of time in the kitchen. But certainly nothing exciting. Not that we had anything planned that we're missing out on anyways, but it is hard to get a change of scenery indeed. And I know you are the extrovert out of the two of us, and the fact that you are all alone, I think is a cruel reality.
It's true. But that said, I mean, there are moments where it would be really nice to have someone else. There are other moments where I think it's really nice that I don't have to worry about anyone else. I just get to watch like whatever I want to watch, and I don't have to worry about anybody else's, schedule or them sucking the Wi-Fi bandwidth or anything like that. So it's not all bad. It's not all bad.
I think people are going to have some new answers to that old thought experiment about who would you want to be trapped on a deserted island with.
So true.
People will have a little more perspective about possibly what they don't want.
Yes, I think that is very, very true.
Well, I know everybody out there is hanging in there, hopefully, and have various situations going on that are good for some reasons and challenging for others. So whatever y'all are going through, very sorry that we're all sort of stuck at home and having to deal with everything that we're dealing with right now. That's kind of why we wanted to record this, because our audience is, for the most part, people who are grieving and then people who are supporting grievers. And we think that this situation presents some really unique challenges to people who are grieving.
Yes.
Especially. Of course, it presents challenges to all sorts of groups of people, but there are some unique challenges for people who are grieving that we are acutely aware of. And we thought we would take a little while to talk about it today.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that people are grieving in so many different ways. And we've talked about this. I think there's the people who were grieving before this all started, and it's impacting those folks in different ways. And then I think there are people who have experienced a death during this stretch of time, whether that's because of COVID or something else, and who are having these kind of uniquely challenging grief I mean, grief is always challenging, but these like really uniquely challenging grief experiences and are detached from some of the normal supports that are out there. So I think we're really lucky at What's Your Grief. We have so many people in our incredible community who come to the site, who email us, who comment on our social media, who have been talking about a lot of things that are coming up for them. And so I always think that we're lucky to be able to look at what are the common challenges people are dealing with, what are some of the themes that are jumping out for us, and to be able to take a little bit of time to talk about those here.
Yeah, this is such a big topic. I mean, and we don't like to record podcasts that exceed a certain amount of time. We know that people sometimes like to get those bite-sized episodes. Well, that's what we assume. We could be wrong. But we would like to talk about, just scratching the surface of some of these things. And we talked about it and kind of agreed that the best way to go about it is to maybe take it one group of people at a time who might be in our audience. So, in particular, I think we have about 3.5 types of audiences in mind. The first one being people who were grieving already prior to this happening. The second one being anybody who is experiencing a loss during this period of time. And then the third being anybody supporting someone who's grieving. So maybe people who are working in the field, trying to support people remotely, or just people who are trying to be supportive family and friends. So I think the first thing we'd like to talk about is just what are some of the challenges that may or may not be presented to people who were already grieving prior to all of this happening and are now finding themselves having to grieve in the social distancing era?
Yeah, I think this is a great question because there's so many ways that we're seeing it play out, but there are a couple of themes that we've heard. And one of them, I think, is, and this was especially true in the first, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. And depending on what we mean by the first 2 or 3 weeks, where you are in the country can define that in many ways. But I think for those who've really started feeling affected by this, feeling impacts on, on that isolation at home or finances or all of the other things that are coming up, one of the things that we were hearing from people right away is just this feeling that maybe they're not thinking about their grief as much. They're not thinking about their loved one as much. All of a sudden, they're just focused on the pressing matters at hand, the things that need to be adjusted to, adapted to, the anxieties and worries that are coming up, the uncertainty. All of that is overwhelming people. And then suddenly their grief doesn't feel quite as present as it did before. And the secondary thought that seems to be coming with that for a lot of people is this incredible guilt, like feeling badly about that, feeling somehow that it is wrong that they aren't creating as much space for their grief or thinking about their loved one. And so I guess, in talking about that, I just wanted to first normalize that that's an experience a lot of people are having, and it's really common. And beyond that, it makes a lot of sense. Like when we look at just neurochemically what happens inside of our brains when we go through crisis and stress and have a situation that's completely foreign and unknown, our brains literally have a neurochemical response where we try to suddenly release chemicals that help us to focus on the task at hand and to be able to kind of get rid of other noise that's going on so that we can make sure we're safe, we're secure, our family members are safe and secure, we have everything that we need. And in many ways, it's a survival type of instinct for us to do that. But I think sometimes then all of a sudden when we're doing that and our brains are doing that, we suddenly feel like, wow, how can this really important thing in my life feel like it's been backburnered or compartmentalized or that it's not being present for me? And so, I think, and you said it really well when we were talking about it earlier, I think that one of the things that is important for us to keep in mind is we vacillate between moments in life from here and forever where our grief is really present and other times when it's not. And that's a really normal, natural thing. And at this moment, while you're defining kind of what your new day-to-day looks like and making sure you're safe and secure and your family is safe and secure, it's completely normal that your grief might not be as central as maybe it was a month ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that people are going to grieve forever. And so it will still be there waiting for you when you're ready for it. And I know people have asked about this recently, and I know this is sort of just like a magnification of what we often hear from people, that I feel guilty when I'm not thinking about my grief. And
Yeah.
like you said, it's totally normal to feel that way, but it's also totally normal to worry about those other stressors, and let those things take priority for now.
I was just going to say that one other thing I think with that is, giving yourself permission, being gentle with yourself about it, not beating yourself up, knowing it's normal. And if it is really weighing on you, one of the things that I think is overwhelming for people right now is our routines are totally out of whack. Things are out of sync. It's just very different than it usually is. So if you're feeling that, it might be worth taking an extra step to say, I'm going to set a time every day where maybe I journal for a little while, or I just reflect. I spend a little bit of time thinking about my loved one. Just spend, if that's something, if it's not
Yeah.
don't beat yourself up about it. You don't have to do that, and that's okay. But if it is something that's really weighing on you, creating that deliberate space might help you a little bit.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying really speaks to the idea of just sort of balancing. I think everybody's equilibrium is thrown off, and so of course your balance with regards to your grief is thrown off, because we also see this on the other end of the spectrum, where there are
Yes.
people who are saying to us, we cannot stop thinking about our grief, and we cannot stop thinking about our loved one. We are constantly filled with anxiety, constantly filled with grief. And also, by the way, I'm stuck inside a house that is filled with reminders of them. And also, the absence of them is a reminder of
Yes.
everything. And so, when we talk about things on the other end of the spectrum, we also suggest, trying to strike that balance where you take a little time to find distraction, and to maybe forget about it all for a little bit, so that you have the time where you're not thinking about it constantly, where it's not totally weighing on your brain, and where you're able to focus on other things and create space for other things. So I think whether you're on one end of the spectrum or another, finding that balance is so important. And sometimes we have to deliberately seek that out by carving out the time for one or the other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for some people, one of the forms of avoidance that can be a little bit easier to spot, or a little harder to spot, sorry, than some of our easy ones to spot, like, avoidance if we're using substances or sleeping all the time, or, those we know, but sometimes keeping busy
Right.
has been our avoidance tool. And, like you described, it might be that the house is full of reminders. It might be that the 75 distracting activities, that your job, perhaps you've been laid off or you're not working as many hours, and then all the other things that you're doing aren't there anymore. And so you may find that suddenly, as those distractions fall away, you're feeling a little bit more overwhelmed. That's feeling really present for you. Maybe you're feeling like your loved one was the person who who always helped to ease your anxiety and made you feel safe and secure. And so suddenly you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by that. So trying to take that in those manageable doses, trying to also make sure that you're looking for ways that you can cope with some of that stuff, even if it's things now that have to readjust to being in the house that would have been out of the house.
Sure. Yeah. I think that is actually the point I went into this wanting to make, or the other consideration for people who are already grieving, and for anybody who's dealing with any type of hardship that pre existed this situation. Perhaps if somebody is struggling with an illness or a psychological disorder or addiction. When we go through our lives, whether we recognize them or not, we find little ways to cope and to manage our stress and our anxiety. And for many people, those coping outlets were things that were accessed outside of the home. And so it might be that somebody has a therapist that they see once a week or once every other week. It might be that somebody goes to a regular support group. Maybe they go to NA or AA. Maybe they have a regular coffee date with their friends once a week. Or it could be that their way of really trying to maintain their mental health and their well being is by exercising. But they went to the gym to exercise, and they engaged in group fitness, and they had people showing them the exercises to do or holding them accountable. And now all those things have fell away and they can no longer do those things. And I think the danger here is sometimes when we lose our coping skills that we've developed over time and that we know work for us and that are tried and true, when we don't have them, we have no idea what to do.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
so it's easier in those moments to say, all right, I'm going to put my constructive coping on hold and I might just dabble a little bit in some of this negative coping to get me through. And then, when I can, I'll go back to those things. But a couple of things about that. One, we don't know how long this is going to go on.
Mm-hmm.
So it would probably be beneficial for people to deliberately sit down and think like, what can my backup constructive coping skills be? Because we don't know when people are going to be able to access those other coping mechanisms. And the other thing is that some of that non-constructive coping, some of that harmful coping can be actually really pretty harmful, especially when you're stuck inside and it feels like Groundhog Day and you have nothing else to do but maybe use substances or eat 24/7 or maybe lash out at everybody in the family or engage in denial. These things can cause some pretty significant consequences at times. So I think one of the top recommendations that we've talked about is finding those backup constructive coping tools to replace the ones that you've lost.
Absolutely. And they don't have to be huge, big, daunting, overwhelming things. I mean, sometimes it's just looking for really small little things. We've had a 10-day challenge / course that has just some really little directed things you can do every single day. And I think the feedback we've gotten from a number of people in that course is just, oh yeah, it's been nice to have like a concrete directed thing
Yeah.
to do, because when we need the coping, if we don't have our go-tos, it can be hard to come up with new ideas. But if we just have something small
Mhm.
and directed, it can go a
Yes.
really long way. So it might not be, I mean, our course and challenge, you can certainly look up and it's free, but there's any number of other options right now of people who are putting out daily self-care tips or daily prompts for journaling or daily things that you can do. So any of those might be a good tool for you if you're just looking for a little bit of guidance.
Yeah. And, I think right at the time when our coping becomes inaccessible, our stress has gone up.
Mhm.
So it's even more of a reason to look into some of these outlets. You can look into trying new things, but also if you haven't already, reach out to your previous coping outlets. If it's a therapist, ask them if they're doing teletherapy and maybe give it a try. It might not feel perfect, but it could be the next best thing. I know that NA and AA are doing online groups.
Mhm.
So many of the grief centers and hospices out there are trying to offer online programs. Even the gym that my family belongs to, they're doing Facebook Live group fitness every day. They have other on demand options that people can do for group fitness classes. It's not our ideal. It's not what anybody wants, and it's not what we're used to, but it can be the next best thing for many people.
Absolutely.
So we just really do encourage people to be flexible and to open themselves up to those things. Because as I said, for a lot of people, their stress is increased. This is already a time when we're more vulnerable to negative coping. And so we really need to think about the things that can be helpful.
Yeah, definitely.
All of us,
All
everybody,
of us
not just grieving
agree.
people, everybody.
Agree. All people.
With that, did you have anything else for people who are already grieving?
No, I think we've covered a lot of it. I think probably thinking a little bit now about just people who are kind of new to this whole
Yeah.
world of grief.
Sure. And I think when we talk about this, of course, we are going to think of the many hundreds of thousands of people who are impacted by loved ones who are dying from COVID-19. But a lot of people are experiencing losses for other reasons as well.
Absolutely. I think that right now, anyone who has lost a loved one in a hospital or hospice has been impacted by not being able to be physically with their loved one in the same way that they would have been otherwise. And maybe that means not at all. And maybe it means to a much lesser degree than they would have been otherwise, or maybe just with one or two family members at a time. There's a lot of different ways that has been impacting people.
Yeah.
So I think that just with the deaths themselves, I think one of the things we're so aware of is that for many people, those last moments of being with a loved one, or that time when a loved one is in the hospital or in hospice, becomes not just doesn't just have an impact in the moment that it's happening. It certainly does then, but it also has an impact on our grief. We go back and we revisit those moments. We go back and we think, I wish that could have been different. Even if you had no control whatsoever over this situation, I think sometimes it's hard not to feel this sense of deep regret that's how it played out, and feeling really a lot of concern for our loved ones who've died, of feeling, I think we have a deep fear as human beings of dying, and a deep fear of dying alone. And when we feel like we weren't able to be present for our loved ones in the way that we would like to be, that's something that's going to be really hard for anyone. And it's a it's not that that's never happened to people before. It certainly has, for many reasons. There are circumstances where people can't be with their loved ones at that time, but I think it's happening more now for people than ever. And it's just a really tough thing to be dealing with.
Yeah, there's certainly complicating factors, to say the least. I think some of what you just described, those thoughts and regrets and wishes, are some of the things that we see really complicate matters for people. And those are those points where people get really stuck in their grief, going around and around, wondering, what was it like for them? Did they suffer? Could I have done anything differently? Could I have been there for them in a different way? So I certainly see how that can complicate matters. And then just the fact that people are being denied the typical rituals, and even the simplest of things are different. And so there can be a sense of loss that is secondary to the actual loss.
Yeah.
And there's not a great solution for it, really.
No, I think there really isn't. And to share personally, you know this, but my uncle died last week, not related to COVID. And it was really sudden, really unexpected. And this is going to sound a little like weird to say, but I don't know that anyone thinks of themselves as a funeral person. And I don't necessarily think of myself as like a funeral person. Like, I am somebody who really appreciates a memorial in the ways that lets us connect and remember our loved ones and come together with other people. But for me, because grief has always been so ongoing, because grief and our connections with our loved ones and with others is something that I know is present over, a lifetime. Sometimes I have not, I think, to this point, recognize just how significant some of those funeral rituals are. And with my uncle, we were not able to have the service in the church that he attended because they're closed currently to any events. And everything was held at the cemetery, where there was a rule that there was allowed to be no more than 6 family members present. Everyone had to stand 6 feet apart from one another. People couldn't touch. Everyone was wearing masks, just what you would imagine. And to see one another struggling, to see people so emotional, and to see everyone just so overwhelmed with the loss of my uncle, and to not be able to just be physically close to one another, to touch one another, to not have to not look around and have that feeling of, oh, look at all these people whose lives that he touched, because though I knew there were many people who would have loved to have been there, they just weren't allowed to be there. It just deeply changed the entire experience, and it made it really, really tough in a way that I both knew was going to be tough and was coming, and yet in the moment ended up being even harder than I expected.
Yeah, what you describe, it just sounds so surreal and uncomfortable. And I think, even as someone like myself, who I don't think of myself as a big hugger or a physical type of person necessarily, I think what probably happens for a lot of people is they underestimate the importance and the significance and the benefit of the ability to be close. Even if you aren't a hugger like me, being that distant from family at a time when closeness just feels natural, I think, again, it's another secondary loss. And it's something that, there's not a good solution for it. I think these simple little things are the things that we really struggle with but they're the things that are so personal and intimate and human.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I think you really hit the nail on the head. I think even if you're not a hugger, just the act of being physically close to standing next to
Yeah.
another person, there's just a closeness there that you suddenly become incredibly aware when you're standing 6 feet from another person and you're struggling and they're struggling. That it's not necessarily that we would be having, our arms wrapped around each other or hugging, but just to be close to each other. I think as humans, there's something about that physical proximity
Mm.
that is really, really important. And I joked to you about this earlier, but I think it's really, really true. In that moment, I wanted a pillow or a stuffed animal. Like that's all I could think about was like I just wanted to be able to like hold on to something. And I
Mhm.
think it just speaks to that like physicality
Yeah.
of things, which again, what a weird and strange want to have in the
Yeah.
moment. I've been reading a million, ideas and articles, and we've been on all these work groups and calls about what do we do to help people during this time. And it's so funny because people have so many wonderful and grand and creative ideas about things that they want to do to help other people. But sometimes I think what we miss is the most simple and basic
Sure.
of things, and that's
Yeah.
really what we feel the loss of.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've even written about it on What's Your Grief about having virtual
Mhm.
gatherings when somebody dies in the absence of being able to be together. And I think that it's like we're trying to build a bridge
Yeah.
to fill this space. But whereas if we were able to have that physical connection, we would have a nice solid bridge. Without it, we have a really rickety bridge that has
Yeah.
a lot of holes in it and that doesn't quite go all the way. And I think it's wonderful that we have a lot of people trying to help to build that bridge any way that we can. And we do what we can, right? And we accept what we can and what we have to, frankly, what we're dealt at this point. But there is still going to be that sense of loss around not being able to have that physical connection. I always think, because when we talk about this, every time we've had a conversation about this, I just flash back to when we asked people about the best things anybody said to them in their grief. And we received hundreds of responses, and many of the good things were not actually words that people said, but they were the actions.
Mhm.
And the actions, time and time again, that we heard were the most meaningful were people being able to just shut up and sit there and
Yep.
be present, but not try and talk or advise or teach or preach or anything. Just being physically there and being physically present. And what we're really lacking, I think, now is that ability to be quietly nearby.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, and I think that part of it now becomes how do we if you are in a position of someone who is grieving right now, how do you look for the little things that might bring you some of that? How do you, think creatively about it, which is hard to do while we're grieving because often when we're grieving, we don't know what we need. And right now, we really don't know what we need.
Right.
I think for many people, if you've never gone to therapy before or gone to a support group or something like that, and this is your first experience of a loss that maybe is feeling incredibly overwhelming, and maybe feeling even more overwhelming to you to think about your first experience with a support group
Mm.
being an online support group or a virtual support
Right.
group.
Right.
That feels like a foreign idea. But I think l- like you just described, that might for you might not be ideal or perfect, but it might be what we have in the moment, and it might be a lot better than nothing at all. For some people, we've heard the feedback that they actually like the virtual support groups and virtual therapy more than they like in person. So, you never know how it's going to go, but I think being open to that, being open to areas where you might be able to find connection that wouldn't have been the route you had gone if you were in a different moment and we didn't have the restrictions that we have. But because we are in the position we're in, sometimes we need to be more flexible and more open than we would have otherwise.
Yeah, I think this goes back to one of the first things we were talking about, and that is that in the absence of the coping we would like and the outlets and the support we would like, what else can we do? Is that better than nothing? And most of the time, yes, something is better than nothing.
Yes.
And so being open to those things. That said, it's still, if you've just experienced a loss, it is still so early. And I do wonder what the impact of not of having to put off things like funerals, memorial services, getting
Mhm.
in-person support, things like that, what the impact of that will be on people's readiness to access resources. So I think what we always say is you're ready when you're ready. If you're ready now,
Mhm.
by all means explore. You may find that it's perfect. You may find, whoa, I'm not ready.
Yeah.
um, and if you're not ready, I think just knowing that there will be help there when you need it and when you're ready for it.
Absolutely. And sometimes just finding out what that help is. And I think that's one of the things. Sometimes I think people feel like they need to, if they're going to start emailing places or calling places and asking about services, they need to be ready to sign on and join. And that's not the case at all. You can start to investigate what possibilities are out there for you, just so you know that they're there for when you are ready. And, each therapist, each center, each place, any offerings they have are going to look really different for you anyway. So just knowing the information can help you to feel reassured that it's there for when you are ready. And also, they might be able to provide you a little bit of guidance on when might be a good time, how are assessing a little bit how you're feeling right now, how you're coping right now, and helping to give you some feedback about.
Yeah, I think that this conversation parallels really closely something else that we have been talking about a lot, and that is how do people as professionals and then people who are just friends and family provide support to people who are
Mhm.
grieving across the void
Yes.
from 6 feet or more away. And I think this is a real struggle, and it's a question that we don't have a great answer to. I think we've already referenced that we've been on numerous calls and webinars, and everybody, I think the one vibe that I'm getting at least in the field of grief and bereavement is that everybody really wants to be able to help. They really want to be able to do something. The
Absolutely.
question is what? And just because we can, does that mean we should in terms of some of the different possibilities? So I think that it's a question without an answer. And I think that when we go back and think about what we just said about how when people are just experiencing a loss, that you really it benefit from keeping it simple in terms of
Hmm.
grief support, just being present, being available. That doesn't really translate in terms of a supportive, grief center, hospice, grief organization type of support program. It's hard
Yeah.
to do from a computer.
From a computer. And I think that we're seeing that. We're just trying to seeing people try to navigate what that looks like. And I think as someone grieving, one of the things that's important, and really both directions for the people offering the support, is remembering that it is absolutely okay to take things in your own pace. And just because a place is offering something doesn't mean you should feel like you have to do it, or you need to do it, or you're grieving wrong if you don't do it, or you're going to screw up your own grief, or you're going to screw up your kids' grief if you feel like you don't engage in a service that's out there. Or maybe you were going to in-person groups and now they've moved online, and you need some time for things to settle out before you can either get back to those groups, or you just decide that they're not what you need right now. All of that is okay. And I think that reminder is important, because right now I think there is this feeling of, let's just put as much out there as we can so people can take what they need and leave the rest. But sometimes when you're overwhelmed and you're grieving and you're seeing that there's so many different things out there and you're not sure what to do and what's best and what's not best, it can be hard to distill that down. So just, again, having some flexibility with yourself. And as professionals, I think that we can really help people by reinforcing to them that idea that this is here if you need it. And it's okay if you don't need it. And, we're trying to be balanced and flexible. And we get that personal need, I think, to when you're in this work of like, you want to feel like you're doing something to help. And so sometimes that need gets in the way of really seeing what is the best thing to do or the best way to proceed. So I think for us, it's a good reminder of just taking a step back, listening to people, hearing what they need, hearing what they don't need, and just pacing ourselves in the way we manage.
Yeah. I think as support people, regardless of the capacity, one thing we want to be careful of, because we don't know what this looks like. We're
Mhm.
kind of just inventing it now or making
Mhm.
it up as we go along. I think we need to be careful that we're not providing the equivalent of like standing in a room with somebody and just like talking at them, like
Yeah.
constantly, like you could try this, you could try this, you could try this, you could do this.
Uh-huh.
Here's some information. It can be overwhelming. So I think on our side we need to work on figuring out what that presence looks like, what that reliability looks like, and what that checking in looks like without being overwhelming. And on the side of people who are grieving, I also encourage you, and this is not the easiest thing to do, and we always encourage people who are grieving to do this with friends and family, but now we're going to go ahead and throw in your support centers, whatever they
Mhm.
are, and provide that feedback about
Yeah.
what you might need that you're not getting, that you're not seeing out there. Maybe if you have a new idea, like maybe you want to call up your grief center that you have a relationship with and say, hey, let's do like a Netflix movie party or whatever it is. They may or may not say, okay, but give them ideas, because people are wanting to meet needs. They just aren't exactly sure how. And I think this is true for friends and family too. That's why they always say, tell me what you need. And we ask people not to say that because it puts the burden on the grieving person, but what we do know is that behind that is often a desire to help, but lack of knowledge about how to do so. So, if you are somebody who feels open to providing feedback to your grief centers, to your hospices, and to your friends and family, telling them
Mhm.
what is working, what is too much, what is too little, can be really helpful and help you to get the support that you need. So everybody wins,
Everybody
hopefully,
wins. Yeah.
ideally.
Absolutely. And we know that's hard. We know that like saying that sounds easy, but we know it's hard to know what you need sometimes. But just being, as as sort of self-aware that you can be of what's working, what isn't working, and being open to providing that feedback, it really can go a long way.
Yes, definitely, it sure can.
Yeah.
Well, I think with that, we'll probably wrap this up for today.
Yeah.
And we don't like to make any promises about when we'll be back until we're into a consistent schedule.
Uh-huh.
We'd love for that to be a truth for us in the future, but
Mhm.
we
But
are
we're realistic.
cautious about promising it.
We know ourselves. We know
Yeah,
ourselves well.
got
So we're cautious with that. But you can always find us at What's Your Grief. We are consistently over there writing new posts. You can subscribe and get our weekly emails. If you're looking for some coping at home, we do have some courses. We have a journaling course that's going on. We have that 10-day challenge that I mentioned. We're going to have, we just have some other things that are available. So you can always find us over there. And you can always email us. We would love to hear what's working for you, what's been not working for you, what's helpful, what's not helpful, how your grief has been impacted by the quarantine, by COVID, by everything that's going on. So please feel free to email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com. And we would love to hear from you.
Yes. All right, everybody, stay safe. Until next time.